Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 23, Section 4, Nation Building in Latin America. We're going to start with a couple terms. You might remember talking about the Creoles. These are colonists of European descent who were born in the American colonies, and the Peninsulares. These are colonists who were born in Spain but moved to the Western Hemisphere and eventually established some of these colonies. So, I think about it in terms of like our peninsulares are kind of like the first generation, and the Creoles are those um, children, most likely, of the peninsulares. So, Creole elites, these were people who were interested in the revolutionary ideals because they resented the way that Spain and Portugal controlled the trade out of the colonies, and they wanted to be able to govern their own lands. During this period of time, we're kind of talking about like the very end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, we had the rise of Emperor Napoleon in France. And a series of wars were started by him known as the Napoleonic Wars. And it's these wars that helped spark the beginning of an independence movement, not only uh, kind of in Europe, but also in the colonies. And needless to say, in Latin America, this was started because Napoleon had overthrown some of the monarchies of Spain and Portugal, weakening their colonies and creating this opportunity to cause a revolt. And one of the first places that we're going to see this kind of revolution is actually in the Caribbean, on the island of what is now known as Hispaniola. The first push for independence came on the island of Haiti, which is kind of the western side of Hispaniola, when Francois Dominique Toussaint Louverture led about 100,000 enslaved people in a revolt against French rule. Now, a little bit about Toussaint Louverture. He is an African American or African of living in the Americas. His parents were enslaved and he was born a slave, but eventually he is able to obtain his freedom, kind of rises up in the military ranks, and has a certain influence um, over many of the peoples that were living there at the time. And because of all this uncertainty that was happening in France, this was the perfect time to basically assert kind of their desire for their independence. And so Haiti declared its independence in the year 1804. Okay. They become the first independent state in Latin America. Now, that's not really the end of the story. Obviously, France wasn't all that happy about this move, and they eventually send troops to defeat Lou uh, Toussaint Louverture. And what ends up happening is he's eventually going to be taken into custody, and he is going to die of complications from pneumonia. But it's the idea that he is the first, and he kind of sparks a movement that's going to happen not only in the Caribbean, but also when we start looking at Central America and into South America as well. So in Mexico, in the year 1810, we have an uprising against Spanish rule that was led by a priest, Father Hidalgo, Miguel Hidalgo, who had given a speech. Just so you know about Father Hidalgo, he was kind of a charismatic priest, was also a professor, and kind of got everybody kind of riled up. And he gave the speech, basically known as the Cry of Dolores. And the goal here was to revolt against the uh, Inlusares, beginning this revolution in Mexico. Not everyone was excited about that, and obviously Hidalgo uh, met resistance. Needless to say, but it is on that date that he gives a speech that is recognizes Mexico's Independence Day, September 16th, 1810. Anyway, Hidalgo ends up having to flee. He ends up in Guadalajara, Mexico, which is kind of east of Mexico City. He kind of regroups, gets a huge following of roughly 100,000 soldiers, and eventually they try to go after the current Spanish-led government. And eventually he's going to be captured and tried and unfortunately executed, and along with that beheaded for treason. But he's kind of known as kind of this charismatic figure when we talk about the independence movement within Mexico. Okay, in a series of events, by the time we get to about 1821, Mexico had actually won its independence after fighting kind of a revolutionary war, when the leader of the royalists, known as Augustin de Iturbide, he had actually been kind of a royalist, and he switched sides to fighting with the revolutionaries. Got to remember he was a Creole as well, and eventually he is going to become the Emperor of Mexico, but it's going to be really short lived. Um, During this year or so that he is in power, he actually reaches out to some of the people living in the United States, and he offers this opportunity to come and establish settlements in what would eventually become known as Texas. And one of the first uh, people to kind of take him up on this offer was a guy named Stephen Austin, which the city of Austin, Texas is named after. The people who settled there, they were given roughly 5,000 acres of land per family, which is just an astronomical amount of land to have. And certainly that was kind of the motivator to get people to leave the United States and come to Texas. But they did have to swear allegiance uh, to the Emperor of Mexico, and they also had to become Roman Catholic to actually take advantage of this opportunity. Down in South America, we also have a revolutionary movement occurring in the early 1800s. Peru, Uruguay, Paraguay, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Brazil, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and eventually Costa Rica and Nicaragua all gained their independence. And some of the key revolutionary leaders were guys like Simon Bolivar, San Martin, and eventually Pedro the First. Okay. In Venezuela, they declared their independence in 1811. It took them about 10 years before this independence really became a reality. In Argentina, they won their independence in 1816. Uh, Bolivar and San Martin led the fight for independence in the northern and western parts of South America. Pedro the First, who was Portuguese, he declared Brazil independent in 1822. In Mexico, we have the rise of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He had been president of Mexico. He kind of dominated politics. Matter of fact, he was really a dictator more than anything. Um, 30 years after independence, and he kind of like led the nation from about 1846 to about 1876. Needless to say, he's going to be the guy that the United States is going to butt heads with. Although Texas was annexed by the U.S. in 1845, this conflict over the territory escalated into a war with Mexico. And Santa Anna happened to be that key figure that we were kind of opposed to. You might recall a little bit about like the Alamo and the fact that it was Santa Anna's men that were attacking those people that were kind of shored up there. Anyway, the United States, we brought in troops, and we actually almost used the same exact path that Hernan Cortez used to attack the Aztecs. Um, years before, and at the beginning of the 1500s, we used almost that same plan of strategy to attack Mexico, and we were able to for the most part, win that war, but at the same time, um, ensure that Texas would be kind of a sovereign part of the United States. Santa Anna, yeah, he would go on to rule Mexico for a number of years after the fact. Anyway, during that time, eventually the United States is going to purchase parts of what is now present day New Mexico and Arizona from Mexico as a result of something known as the Gadsden Purchase. This was made in 1854 with the purpose of possibly trying to make an all-weather railroad, transcontinental railroad line in the southern part of the United States. Got to remember, 1854, this is just in uh, the few years before the American Civil War. And obviously, a route through the South was kind of not going to happen during the war years because, the South was our enemy. But eventually, you're going to see a lot of people moving into this area. Cities like Tucson, which today is a major metropolitan area, this is something that we're going to acquire out of that. Anyway, Benito Juarez brought stability and liberal reforms to Mexico. That included separation of church and state, land distribution to the poor, and an educational system that was for all Mexicans. Juarez is probably one of the more respected leaders that comes out of Mexico. It's still adored to this day, but his beliefs probably have a lot more in common with maybe some of the things that you might have seen in the United States, with the exception of the land distribution to the poor. Thank you very much.